Thank you all so much for being here with me today. I'm your host, Sherry, and you are listening to From the Dark Side. It's almost Halloween, my favorite time of the year. I wanted to bring you guys a special Halloween episode, and I stumbled upon this story from 1957. My sources are in the description area. This is episode 130, The Case of Peter Fabiano. We're going back to 1957 for this one. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. Elvis Presley bought Graceland for $100,000. Gas was 28 cents a gallon. President Eisenhower became the first president to ride in a helicopter. The hula hoop and the frisbee made their debut. The Cat in the Hat by Dr. Seuss was published. Gunsmoke was the most popular television show. And in weird news from 1957, on April Fool's Day, the BBC aired a segment showing farmers harvesting spaghetti from trees. Viewers began calling in and asking how they could harvest their own spaghetti tree. Peter and Betty Fabiano, along with Betty's 15-year-old daughter Judy, live in Sun Valley, which is a neighborhood inside Los Angeles, California. Peter and Betty are in their mid-30s, and Peter is a hairdresser. He owns an upscale salon in the area. Doesn't the name Peter Fabiano sound like the owner of a hair salon? It just fits. Peter and Betty have been married for 3 years. Their house is 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. It sits on the corner of a street in a busy residential neighborhood. This house is only 2 years old, so this is a new development. I, too, live in a busy residential neighborhood, and every year we get at least 60 or 70 trick-or-treaters. You know how after a while the kids tend to thin out? You get 1 or 2 stragglers towards the end and realize it's likely over, so you turn your porch light out and call it a night. Another Halloween has come and went. That's what happened to Peter and Betty Fabiano, except they had one more person at the door hours after everyone had stopped trick-or-treating. A little after 11 p.m. on October 31st, 1957, Peter and Betty are calling it a night. All the trick-or-treaters have come and gone. Betty's 15-year-old daughter was going to bed too. Most reports say Betty had 2 children from a previous marriage, a daughter and a son named Richard, but I can't find anything about this other child being home at the time, so maybe he's spending the night at a friend's house. The house is quiet. They're laying in bed discussing their upcoming anniversary. Peter mentions that they should have a Christmas party for friends and family at their home in a couple months. Then they hear the doorbell ring. They're both kind of like, who can that be at this late hour? Trick-or-treating has been over. Betty asks him, aren't we out of candy? But Peter said no, he had bought way more than needed. Peter gets out of bed and puts on his slippers and heads downstairs to check it out. Feeling annoyed, Peter grabs the candy bowl and makes his way towards the front door, expecting to see trick-or-treaters on the other side. Betty is upstairs, but heard Peter open the door. She hears him say, "Isn't it a little late for this?" Then she hears someone say, "No." She couldn't tell if it was a man's voice, a woman's voice, or even a child's voice. She thought she heard 2 voices coming from outside, but couldn't make out what else they said. Next, she hears a loud popping sound. It was so loud that it woke her teenage daughter, who was sleeping. Betty runs downstairs where she sees her husband Peter laying on his back inside the doorway. The bowl of candy was scattered around him. He had been shot square in the chest and was dying right in front of her while clutching his chest. She tells her daughter Judy to run down the street and bang on the door of their neighbor, who is a police officer. Peter was rushed to Sun Valley Hospital, where he died shortly afterwards. Police believe that the person who showed up at the door must have been in costume because Peter had said, "Isn't it a little late for this?" There was only one witness, and that was a teenage boy in the area who saw a car speeding away from the house. Police arrive and there's no gun shells, so whoever shot him had collected those. Why did someone shoot Peter? This has all the vibes of a mafia type hit, but Peter wasn't known to be involved in any stuff like that. According to True Crime Edition, he did have a charge from 9 years prior for bookmaking. I had to look it up to see what bookmaking was. It's a gambling term, and according to Google, it's basically someone who accepts bets and uses a book of figures to calculate the odds. I didn't know that was illegal, but whatever, it's the 50s. Peter did it. He was charged and convicted of it. It was a misdemeanor offense. He paid his fine or served his term. It's been 9 years and he hasn't done it since. He also has no other criminal history. Peter's a hairdresser. He's well liked and successful. He doesn't have any clients out to hurt him or any enemies that want him dead, except for one. Betty was so upset that she ends up having to be sedated at the hospital for a few days. When Betty is able to leave and is able to start talking, she is brought into the police station. They ask her if Peter had any enemies, and Betty gave them the name of a person who despised Peter, a woman by the name of Joan Rabel. A little backstory on Peter and Betty. They met a few years prior while Peter was working as a bartender. Betty was running a beauty salon, and when Peter mentioned he also was a hairdresser, she says, "Why don't we work together?" They became business partners and were even able to open a second store. The two quickly married and life was good, at least for a while. Peter and Betty began having some marital issues. Nothing super crazy, just normal quarrels. It was during this time that Betty began hanging with a woman named Joan. Joan is around 40 years old and she is a photographer. She first met Peter when she came into his salon looking for work. She was recently divorced and starting life on her own. Her husband was a pharmacist and supported them well, so being broke is a new thing for Joan. She only knows photography and wasn't making enough to support herself, so Peter gave her a job as a receptionist. Betty and Joan became very close. They began hanging out all the time and talking on the phone every night. Betty tells Joan that she's beginning to feel unhappy in her marriage to Peter. You'd think this would be awkward since Joan works for Peter, but Joan is like, "Leave him then. You can come move in with me." Betty's like, "Christ, I didn't say it was that bad. We just had a couple arguments." Joan ends up convincing Betty that her husband is a terrible husband, and she convinces her to leave him and move in with her. The reports from the 1950s say Betty and Joan had an air quotes abnormal relationship. They use abnormal in the newspapers because it's as close as they can get to saying homosexual without saying it, but yes, they were lovers. Betty lived with Joan for a short while before saying, "Look, Joan, I appreciate you taking me in. I've had a lot of fun with you, but my marriage to Peter is worth saving. I need to go home to my husband now." She breaks up with Joan and moves back into her and Peter's house. Now, Peter isn't just going to let her come waltzing in after all of this. He tells her, "If you want to give our marriage another try, you must cut off all contact with Joan. No talking to her whatsoever. I also don't even want to hear her name mentioned in this house." Peter even goes as far as to fire Joan from the salon. Joan is really upset that Betty has gone back to her husband. She's alone now and doesn't have a job anymore. Could she have been the one that shot Peter? After all, she was his only enemy. Everyone else seemed to love him, including Betty. Once Betty was back home and away from Joan, her and Peter's marriage was better than it had ever been before. But now we have a scorned ex-lover in the picture. But Betty is completely done with Joan. She doesn't ever want to see her again. Betty would later say of Joan, "Peter was the only one who had Joan figured out for what she is. We separated because of my friendship with her. Finally, we reconciled when I realized my husband was right." Betty tells the investigators that Joan is the only person she can think of that hated Peter, so naturally they want to go talk to Joan. 2 weeks after Peter's murder, they bring her in, and she says that she is very close to the Fabiano family and wouldn't do anything to hurt Peter. Plus, she says she has an alibi. She says she was home by herself all evening. She says to ask any of her neighbors. They will tell you her car was there all night. This checks out. Joan's car was parked out in front of her house all of Halloween night. But a woman named Margaret comes forward and says, yes, Joan's car was at her house because she borrowed my car. Joan's alibi of being home all night is now out the window because Margaret talked. Margaret says Joan asked to borrow her car for some reason. She thought it was odd because she had her own car right there, but she trusted Joan and all Joan needed to do was go to the grocery store. She says when Joan returned, there was 37 miles traveled, and she knew this from her odometer. There were plenty of grocery stores close by. Joan had said she went out of her way to go to her favorite grocery store, not one of the ones in town, which is perfectly fine if she's telling the truth. But why lie to the police and say you were home all night? As well, why not take your own perfectly functioning car sitting in the driveway? Besides, they realized Peter and Betty's house was approximately 16 miles away, putting the round trip at 32 miles, give or take, for a few stops. Police tried to get a confession out of Joan. They tell her it's obvious you dressed up in costume, you waited till all the kids had come and gone, you walked up to the doorstep and shot Peter when he answered the door. But Joan was adamant that she didn't shoot Peter, and with no solid proof of evidence, they were forced to let her go. Police toyed with the idea that maybe this was something Betty and Joan had planned together. Joan would kill Peter, not just because she's a scorned lover in a love triangle, but because Betty wanted her to so that the two could be together again. They realized that likely isn't what happened because Betty was very distraught over Peter's death. She also didn't want anything to do with Joan after their breakup. She hasn't been around Joan for months. She sees Joan as someone who manipulated her into leaving her wonderful husband. 1 month after Peter's murder, police finally get the break they're looking for. They receive an anonymous tip. The person tells them that the murder weapon that was used to kill Peter Fabiano is in a rental locker at a department store. So I learned that way back in the 1950s, you could rent a locker from a department store. Learn something new every day, I guess. If you're shopping and you want to store your purse or whatever, you can. So police make their way to Bullock's department store and find the locker the anonymous tipster said it would be in. A .38 revolver was really located inside. They run the ballistics on the gun and determine that this was the gun used to kill Peter on Halloween night. They go to all the gun shops in the area and learn the .38 revolver was registered to a lab assistant who works at a children's hospital, a 42-year-old woman by the name of Goldine Pizer. Who the heck is this and what connection does she have to Peter? Police were shocked because this whole time they believed it was Joan who had done this. She had the motive, she had the alibi that didn't check out, so who was Goldine? Police don't need to know this info right now. They just need to know that yes, this gun belongs to Goldine. Yes, it was located in a rental locker that Goldine had used. That's all they need in order to issue an arrest warrant. They show up to her house and place her under arrest for the murder of Peter on Halloween night. Goldine is brought back to the police station and, surprisingly, she begins spilling all the tea. She was actually relieved that it was finally over. She was having a real hard time hiding all this knowledge, and she welcomed her arrest. Goldine's like, yeah, I killed Peter, but only because Joan convinced me to. Goldine is recently divorced as well. Her and Joan lived 1 mile from one another near the Sunset Strip. Their relationship, too, was described as abnormal. They first met at a party where Joan was the photographer and snapped a picture of Goldine and her date. They quickly became close friends after that. Goldine and Joan were known to sit in coffee shops and gossip and talk about how men are terrible. For months, the two got together almost daily to chit-chat. Joan begins going on and on about Peter. She says he's an evil person who treats his family, and especially his wife Betty, horribly. She says he ruins the lives of everyone around him. Just as a side note, there is no evidence to back this up. Everyone said that Peter and Betty were great together and didn't have many issues in their marriage. Although we don't know what goes on behind closed doors, we don't know what Betty told Joan about Peter. But from the surface, it seems like Joan was lying to Goldine. For months, this continued on, Joan rambling about Peter and that he fired her and he's terrible. Goldine has grown to hate this man, even though she's never met him. Peter now lives in Goldine's brain rent-free up there. Eventually, Joan convinces Goldine that we should kill Peter. Actually, you should kill Peter. If I do it, everyone will know it was me, but no one would ever suspect you. Goldine is pretty timid and gullible. She says, "Okay, what do I need to do?" Joan says, "Let's go get costumes, and on Halloween night we'll go up to his door, and when he answers, you just shoot him." Joan takes Goldine to Peter's salon and gets her hair done so she could see exactly who Peter is and get acquainted with his features. Goldine says that Joan had given her the money for the gun, so she went and purchased it. Joan showed up to her house with costumes and in a friend's car. They drove to Peter and Betty's house and waited outside for all the trick-or-treaters to go away. Then they watched as the night went on a little longer. Eventually, they saw the lights in the house turning off one by one, including the upstairs bedroom light. That's when they both walked to the door and rang the doorbell. Peter opens it. Goldine had the gun in a paper bag so he wouldn't suspect it was a gun. He would think it's a bag to hold candy. She shot him, and then they ran back to the car and drove away. Goldine says when they got away, Joan kissed her and then said, "Thank you. Now forget you ever knew me." Goldine was basically a hit woman, but she did it for free. She was used by Joan to kill her enemy. She's also kind of lost now because up until that moment, she was given clear instructions from Joan. Now the murder's over and she doesn't have Joan there guiding her every step. Now she has this murder weapon and she needs to get rid of it. So she rents a locker at a department store and just stores it in there. She was relieved when she was finally arrested. She told reporters that Joan had her under a spell. She had filled her mind with her hatred for Peter, and she would have done anything to help her friend. Goldine says, "I'm not an evil person." She says she even quit her job as a lab technician recently because she hated having to prick people's fingers to draw blood. She tells them, "I just wanted to help Joan." Goldine is given an examination to see if she's mentally incompetent. How could someone be convinced to kill a person they've never met? Goldine says, "I had no motive, personally. Whatever motive I had was to please Joan. I was always easily influenced. I have been impressionable and always trusting." After hearing this, the doctor wrote, "The only thought she had was that she had saved her friend Joan from an evil person." Joan was also given a mental evaluation to see if she's competent enough to stand trial. Back then, gay men and lesbians were thought to have a psychological disorder, which is so sad, and I'm glad we've progressed as a society. The American Psychiatric Association finally removed homosexuality from their list of mental disorders in 1973. A lot of people felt sorry for Goldine. She thought she was helping a friend and doing her this favor. Then the friend turned on her. She just said, "Thanks, never come around me again." She was completely used. I get it. However, Goldine still killed a person. She shot him in cold blood. The police bring Joan back, and she is informed that Goldine has confessed and told them all about how you convinced her to kill Peter for you. She listens in as Goldine confesses a second time. The two women are indicted by a grand jury for murder. Goldine, although she was the one who pulled the trigger, Joan is the one who coordinated everything. She bought the gun, she bought the costumes, she was the one with motive. Goldine didn't know Peter. She only met him once, and that was when Joan took her to the salon so she could point out who he was. On March 11th, 1958, both women pled guilty to second-degree murder. Not only did they not get charged with first-degree murder, they are both only sentenced to 5 years to life. It's unclear exactly how much time Joan and Goldine served in prison, but we know they were eventually released and went on to live the rest of their lives. One source showed that Goldine was released in 1971 after serving only 13 years. According to the California death records, she died in 1998 at the age of 83. I can't find any further info about Joan, including when she died. Yes, I say died because if she is still alive today, in 2024, she would be 106 years old. I would also be able to find that info out. You can't live to 106 and not make the internet somewhere. Betty ended up selling both of her husband's salons. She got remarried 9 years after Peter's death. Betty died in 1999 at the age of 81. Some big questions that always get brought up in this case are, was Betty involved in this murder? Was this something the three of them concocted? It's not likely because both of these women, Joan and Goldine, would have easily turned on her during the interrogation, especially Goldine. If not then, they would have during their court testimony. Not only that, but when Betty was taken to the police station to give a statement after her husband's murder, she said, check into Joan. We both hate her and she hates Peter. She didn't say, oh, well, this may have been a mafia hit or something along those lines. She name-dropped Joan right away. After Joan's arrest, Betty told reporters, Joan is cold, cruel, and inhumane with no heart. She's a real Lucrezia Borgia. At first, I thought no torture would be good enough. Now, so what? Nothing will bring him back no matter what they do to her. End quote. I had to look up what Lucrezia Borgia was. She was an Italian woman from the 1400s. During the Italian Renaissance, she was the illegitimate child of Pope Alexander IV. She married 3 times into powerful political families, which helped build the political power of her own family. I'm not sure why this is a comparison to Joan, except that she climbed over others to get what she wanted. Reporting from Walt Keegan for the Valley Times in December 1957, Betty said that she never met Goldine before, but she did talk to her on the telephone and claimed Goldine said she wanted to meet her one day when she is out of prison. Was Peter really a terrible person, as Joan claimed? To her, he was. He fired her, he took away the love of her life, he forbid her from ever coming around, but to everyone else, he was wonderful. How did Joan and Goldine know Peter was going to answer the door? What if Betty or her teenage daughter Judy would have answered it? Would they have said, go get your husband, go get your stepdad? How did they know Betty wouldn't be standing behind him as he opened the door? These answers likely died with Joan and Goldine. There was a public outcry that these 2 women got off too easy, they killed an innocent person in cold blood and didn't serve life in prison. I will think twice before answering the door on Halloween night when all the trick-or-treaters have come and gone. I'm thankful for the technology of my Ring camera. I could just look at my phone and say, hi, go away, if something seems not right on my front porch. Rest in peace to Peter and Betty Fabiano. I hope you all have a wonderful Halloween, and I'll see you all again soon. Take care, and much love to you all.